adjusting how we design our digital products and websites, and delve into the evolution of responsive design. So he's a partner and design lead at ZURB and works with startups to Fortune 100 companies. He also developed Foundation, an open source framework, and it's on the top 20 open source projects on GitHub. So could you please help me welcome John. Before you do, put that up. That one's mine too.
Hi, everybody. How's it going?
So well.
Yeah, seriously. How you doing? Hi. There we go. That was so much better. Thank you.
We can see those coffees in the back are empty if you need some coffee.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, by all means, if I'm getting really boring and you need coffee, you won't hurt my feelings. Just get up and go get some or something. It'll hurt my feelings a lot more if you actually fall asleep. You'll have to bear with me for just one moment here while I actually get this thing going. I swear that will not take me terribly long. Does network actually work? Alright, that's disappointing. Okay.
There are Ethernet cables up there if you want to plug in.
I actually just need my phone to find my computer so that I can walk around because I pace while I talk. So I just need this thing to connect. Well, thank you for having me tonight. While I sit here and fumble with technology, it's probably as good a time as any to cop to. I'm actually slightly intimidated talking here because I became aware of the ACM in general when I started college. I started at Georgia Tech and I started as a computer scientist. So like, hardcore kind of code, like I was going to be a code guy. And I got through about 3 years of that and went, yeah, I'm really not going to be a code guy. I'm not going to be a computer science kind of guy. And instead I went into design and some of the foofier kind of stuff. So it's very seldom that I'm at a talk where I actually feel like one of the least nerdy people in the room. But I'm feeling it pretty hardcore right now. So there's that. But anyways, yeah, thank you for having me. Tonight's talk, I hope that you'll find it interesting. It's probably on the lighter side of code, I suppose. But it mostly deals with the web and kind of like where things are going with the web. I know he did a great job actually introducing me. I tend to fumble over introducing myself and talking about myself. But my name is Jonathan Smiley. I'm a partner at ZURB. ZURB is a design agency down in Campbell, so we're very close. So what I typically do day to day is I work on client projects. I work on design projects for startups or larger companies. We have some clients that are fairly good size these days. But a large part of what I do for my job is to work on the web, is to build things for the web. So I'm very, very excited about the web, and I get really amped up and really sort of animated and ridiculous about where the web is going and how the web works and what things are going to happen with the web and what we can do with the web. And that was actually what influenced the talk that I'm going to give to you tonight. I've been doing this for a little while. Don't worry, this is actually an updated version. I'm not telling you like last year's stuff. But what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is that the future is responsive. And I'll try not to get too much in the way of my own slides, but if I don't walk around some, I get really antsy. Plus, if I stay on one side, I tend to just fixate on one side, and I just talk to one side, and the other side tends to feel sad. So I'm going to try not to do that either. I will try to talk to everybody if I can. But the future, at least as we've seen it at ZURB, and at least as we're seeing it evolve right now, is the future is responsive. Web design is changing considerably, and we need to change with it. And when I say that the future is responsive, the future is actually already here. You guys are techie types, and you are fairly in tune with sort of like what's coming up at least as far as technology goes for the future of what we do and what people just in general do. The future is absolutely already here, at least for the web. The landscape of how people use the web has changed irrevocably in the last about 2 years to something that very few people honestly saw coming, and those that did deserve really huge props. But not everybody saw it coming, and it changed almost overnight. Is it better if I do that, or is this? I can juggle, or I can. This will be better. All right, cool.
Give me 1 second.
That would be personal. All right, there we go. Okay, can you hear me? Does it work? All right, well, that's cool. I don't have to carry this thing around now. Oh, it sounds a lot louder. Okay. I can't put this to anything. Seriously, what's wrong with me? Come on. You know, it's just sticking in my pocket. Cool. All right. Great. So like I was saying, the future's already here, and the reason that the future is here is because of things like this. This is a pile of some of the many devices that you can use now to access the web. They are currently being hugged by a woman who, I swear to God, her name is Liza Danger Gardner. Her middle name is actually Danger. It's kind of awesome. She's a strange bird, but she's funny. And she's hugging this big pile of devices because she is also really excited about these devices and what they mean for what's happening to the web. Now, this picture is actually a little bit of a lie, because when I say that there's tons and tons of devices that you can use to access the web, what this picture is really a picture of how much she and the person who took it love Apple devices. Those are all the Apple devices in that picture. And in fact, I think I even missed a couple. There's a couple of like lonely Kindles and like a BlackBerry that's just kind of like hanging out sad by itself down here. So that's really just a pile of Apple devices. But the number of devices that you can use to access the web is astronomically exploding. It just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. And there's, at this point, there's really no end in sight. There will be at some point, because at some point we'll just be buried in them. But mobile users are going to outnumber desktop users this year, pretty much worldwide. There'll be some holdouts for a while, but on average, mobile use is going to be higher than traditional sort of desktop use for the web, sometime within the next probably 4 or 5 months. So this is right now. Like this is pretty serious. In some parts of the world, mobile use is already drastically higher than traditional or desktop kind of use. In places like Africa or Asia, it is much higher percentage to be using mobile than to be using anything else. In fact, in places like Africa, typically everything is done through mobile devices, like banking and everything else, because there aren't banks. You bank through your phone. In some of these places, people carry around bags of SIM cards because they have like a different SIM card for the different things that they do. They have different contacts, and they have different like applications, they have different stuff. So mobile is kind of a thing, and I think it's probably going to stick around. And this has meant that there's some new challenges when it comes to designing or building products or services or sites that work on these different devices. So you guys know who Samsung is, right? Everybody knows who Samsung is. Samsung is at this point, is one of the dominant players in Android devices or in Android phones. They kind of ran away with that market. They started just like making fun of Apple, and they got some press, and it was pretty legit. Samsung has made 40 different Android phones, just phones. They have made 40 different Android phones that people can buy and that people still use. And the crazy thing about these 40 phones is that between them all, there are 9 different resolutions that they use and 20 different screen sizes. And that's just Android phones from Samsung. Very large group of crazy things that you have to deal with if you want to be on those kinds of devices. And that is just Android phones. They are only one of about 40 manufacturers of Android phones. That doesn't include many others. And that's just Android phones, not iPhones, iPads, Android tablets, Windows tablets, Surface things, Windows phones, Blackberries, Kindles, the whole shebang. I actually struggled to find a number for a decent count of the number of disparate mobile devices you can purchase and use. It's like in the thousands. There's no good record of it. So there's quite a few of these things. And the interesting thing is that you want to be on them for whatever you're doing, because it's where people are going to be. If whatever you're doing is intended to be used by humans, in all likelihood at some point you're going to need to be on these kinds of devices. But designing a different interface or building a different thing for every device is impossible. I don't care how good you are, I don't care how fast you are, it doesn't matter how much money you can throw at it, it doesn't matter how awesome you are at writing code, you will never get through all of them ever. So you can't do individual things. But not considering devices is a death sentence. If whatever you're working on isn't considering sort of the mobile experience, isn't considering how people are going to use whatever it is you're doing, on some other device, on some sort of smaller device or portable device or what have you, what you're doing has a very short shelf life. And you don't want that, because everybody likes their stuff to be used. And we've really, frankly, only barely started solving this. This cropped up so fast that for a little while, everybody who at least works on the web, for sure, was sitting there going, while we just watched the devices and the people using just blitz right past us. And you could see it if you go back and look at like the release of the iPhone, where one of the major things they touted was, look, you can look at actual web pages and zoom in on them and pan around and da-da-da-da-da-da. because no one was ready to build things that actually work on those devices at all. They had to build them to work with what existed. We've just barely started solving this, and we've got frankly a long ways to go. So with all of that gloom and naysaying in mind, hi. Like I said, I'm from ZURB. ZURB is we're 15 years old now, actually. We're having a party on Saturday. But we've been around for a little while. We've worked with over 250 startups now over the 15 years, and created about 2 billion in exits, of which we saw not enough. We did all right, but 2 billion is a lot of money. We've worked with some of the bigger players, like the Facebooks and the eBays and the Yahoos and what have you. And it's been cool because we've actually had the opportunity to work in a lot of different spaces and work with a lot of different size players and work on a lot of different kinds of things. In fact, we have anywhere from like 14 to 18 projects going at any given time, which there's only 23 of us, I think. So we keep pretty busy. But we've been able to see sort of how things are evolving and where the web is going and how some of the stuff is actually going to work, which is really, really exciting for us. So what are our options for mobile products? Mobile's a pretty wide field right now. Like I said, there's several thousand of these devices. So this is a pretty big thing. And we've had a couple of options. Traditionally, we've had a couple options. When these smartphones, which you could make a very reasonable argument that the mobile web did not begin with smartphones. There was certainly a web before that, and there are feature phones that can do things, and that's true. The web in any capacity that we here in the bubble of Silicon Valley would consider the real web really began with the release of the iPhone. There's almost no way to argue your way around that. So since then, what we've basically had available is we've had the web. And originally the web was, if you remember when the iPhone came out, it was, yeah, we're never going to have an app store, you're going to write web apps. Which was interesting because it was to some extent prophetic in that I do actually believe that web apps will win the day. It just wasn't ready at all. Most of the apps you think of using and things like that, if you considered building them for the web like 4, 5, 6 years ago, would have been terrible, terrible, terrible apps. They would have been unusable. So it was just not ready at all. And that's why the app market sprang up. The app market came up and Apple and then other players kind of went, okay, you know what, the web is really not doing it for us right now, so let's make native apps. And it's been hugely successful. I mean, seriously, raise your hand if you don't have a phone with apps installed on it. Legit, back there. No apps, nothing on their phones. Solid. Lonely, but solid.
Dumb phone, can't romance.
All right, there you go. See, I won't say everyone then. Almost everyone uses apps. I bet 3/4 of the room has probably sunk 5 or 10 hours into Angry Birds, right? Just me? No? Okay. So the app market's pretty huge. But the app market has problems. Apps have problems. And the big problem with apps right now is that they are not affordable. They don't really get you everything that you want, or they require a significant investment of time or energy or money. And you can make an argument that those are all the same thing. They require a pretty significant investment to do. And that's getting worse and worse because there's 40 Samsung Android phones. They have somewhere in the neighborhood of like, I think there's only like 7 or 8 that share any kind of commonality of spec or of what you actually have to build for. So it's a pretty diverse market just in that little niche, and it only gets bigger and bigger. In fact, just about every day I think there's a new like Android flagship of the month kind of thing. So there's a ton of these things. And apps just aren't going to get us all the way there. They're not going to get there for most people, which is why the web, at the end of the day, the responsive web, is going to win. I'm almost positive. The web is an extraordinarily egalitarian platform, and it works almost everywhere. You can make a really reasonable argument that it doesn't work on Windows phones very well, but they'll get there. It works on Surface tablets pretty well. They actually used IE10 for that. They inexplicably used IE8 for the current Windows phones, which I don't know. It just makes me sad. So why responsive design? Well, responsive design is beautiful because responsive design scales. Responsive design, and I'll get into sort of the technical definition of responsive design, but actually I was talking to David just before this, and he asked me actually an interesting question, which was, does responsive design really just mean web pages that scale to different screen sizes? And I would say responsive design really just means building something that is relatively agnostic to how it's going to be presented to a user. It is something that can respond to the characteristics of the device or of the machinery, essentially, that you're using to view it. And the beautiful thing about responsive design is that it scales to all kinds of these devices. So remember this thing, you know, all these crazy Samsung things, multiply that by 10 or, frankly, quite a bit more. And you can start to see what you actually have to support in order to get whatever it is you're working on into the hands of all the people who want to use it. And the only thing that works there is something like responsive design. And it's really not devices and it's not screens. It's really just four corners. If you think about it right now, pretty much every instance of us interacting with technology in any sufficiently sort of high-level way is done through some form of four corners. It's some form of you're being presented things in a box. There are exceptions to that, and there are other things that are coming out. But even if you think about something like Google Glass, which we're all nerds here, I'm sure we're all reasonably up on sort of what Google Glass is. It's a thing you wear on your head, but it's still a screen. It's still four corners. It's just a little screen. I think I read that it's equivalent to a 25-inch HD screen from 8 feet away, I believe, which is an interesting way of thinking of it. But even that's just four corners. That's for now. That'll probably change. Whoa, screw that up. That arrow is just doing its own thing. Whatever. This is what I get for, you know what the problem was? They weren't all moving at the exact same speed, so I tried to tweak their little pads so that they all go out evenly. And then I think I moved something and I forgot. That's my bad. But it's not just these four, it's not just the size of the screen that is a characteristic that we care about with these devices. Because it's also orientation or rotations of the device, it's the location of the device, it's what you can see, it's what you can hear. It's funny because it's fascinating because actually the computer that is inside my iPhone is, for one thing, and I thought this was astonishing, I read this, it was almost a year ago now, I think. The computing power of an iPhone is actually higher than the computing power of all of NASA when we put a man on the moon, which is pretty incredible. If you think about it, because this is really, really tiny, and we were talking computers that were like the size of like warehouses and stuff. I say it like I was there, I clearly wasn't. Sorry. But it's amazing because actually these devices, even compared to like my laptop, and I love my laptop. My laptop is my friend, one of my best friends. That sounds so sad. I really like my laptop. Even that sort of pales in comparison to what this can do, because this has all kinds of other things that my laptop can't do. It knows exactly where I am. It knows exactly which way it's pointed and how it's being rotated. It has a camera on both sides. It can know who's looking at it or who it's looking at. It's actually quite a fascinating little device. And the capabilities of these things actually eclipse to some extent the more traditional machines that they're replacing, despite them being slightly less just computationally powerful. So they're pretty interesting. And when I say the responsive web is going to win, I'm not crazy. I know there's still native things that have to happen, so what's really going to happen is a combination of the responsive web in large part and some degree of native functionality, which is already happening, actually. You can see it if you track sort of like mobile browser development. There's more and more hooks into actually accessing lower level kind of stuff on the device's hardware acceleration, accessing the camera, the hardware, the file system, things like that within these browsers. To the point where we'll actually reach something where building a native app is really just a matter of building a web app that's sufficiently optimized for the things it really needs to be optimized for. And that's what's beautiful about the web. That's what's beautiful about the responsive web, is that it is an equal playing field for all kinds of devices because it is sort of one-ish spec or standard that they can all kind of follow. They don't quite follow it exactly, which is why people like me still have a job. We have to test them on all the different devices. But it's close, and it's getting closer and closer. So what does this mean for product design? Would anybody in here actually say that they are a product designer? Is that a role? Okay, I got a few hands. Everybody here work on products in some form or fashion? Works on some kind of product? That's most hands. Product, if you think of it as a big enough definition, product is really just a thing that you are building that is intended to be used by someone else. And that is, frankly, to some level, what most of us do, unless you're building stuff entirely for yourself, in which case you're still building product because it's for you. So what does this mean for product design? We're really big on product design at ZURB. That's what we do. And we believe that the path to creating great products is something that we call something called responsive prototyping. We call it rapid responsive prototyping. We just call it responsive prototyping at the moment. So what is responsive prototyping? Well, the first thing that it is it's about giving up control. Now, this is harder for me than it is for some, because I came into this field as a designer, and we are very, it's got to be a nice way of saying obsessive and anal. We're really, really desperate to control all the pixels and have everything in just its right place and be just right. The interesting thing about responsive design or about responsive prototyping is that you have to give up some of that control, because you just can't have that level of control when you have to consider every single device on the planet. There's just no way. I can't test it everywhere, and I can't know what it's going to do everywhere. What we have to do is we have to build things that are going to work as we expect them to, in very subtly different ways, on the different things that they're actually going to be used on. So if you think about your content, and I say content, that could mean a service that you provide, it could mean a news that you feed out, it could mean anything. You might like to think that your content just goes from you to your, ooh, better not do that. Goes from you to your customer, to your user, to your whatever. It's just like it's a channel from me to you. And they are going to absorb it in whatever way I offer it, right? I'm going to build it in a certain way, and that's how they're going to use it, damn it. They're not. What they're going to do is they're going to get it through their TV or their phone or their computer or through RSS or through email or through Twitter or through Facebook or through basically whatever they want. The expectation for users at this point is that you have a thing that they would like, and they would like to have it in whatever way best suits them at the moment. And they may choose for that to be multiple different things. There's actually an evolving pattern right now that for many people, especially in e-commerce, what typically happens is that people will do their, they will do their shopping on their laptop in the morning because they're doing it at work when they should be working. They'll do it on their phone in the afternoon because then the boss has caught on to them and they can't do it on their laptop, so they need to do it on their phone. And then they'll go home and they'll do it on a tablet. So there's actually vast swaths of people who go device to device to device through the day to do the same task. And they are going to want to do that whether you make that easy for them or not. And if you make it hard for them, they just won't do it with you. They'll do it with someone else. So you have to know that they are going to get their content in whatever way best suits them, and there's very little that you can do about that. So we have to start with the content and then layer in everything else. So content is king when it comes to responsibly building things. Whatever your core service is, whatever your core content is, that is the nugget which everybody wants to get to. You have a question?
Yes. Could you comment a little bit about how mediated web access through Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever social site you like is going to be different than going to the original source raw? What are these social sites going to do that transforms your experience a little bit?
Whatever they want, to some extent. What you'll see with the social networks now is that they want to own more of your time. So they are going to try to take as much of it as they can, and they will do so by basically taking what you've put together and presenting it in their own way to keep people for as long as they can. You can see it with Twitter cards, which are fairly new but are going to become more prevalent. Basically, it's a way to offer up services where you literally don't ever leave Twitter. And Twitter, I'm sure, is super excited about that. Great example of this actually is Facebook Home, which was announced actually like a couple weeks ago and released within a week, I think. It was like a week ago, which is essentially a layer of abstraction now on top of Android, which says that the way you interact with your Android phone is through Facebook, period. You launch apps through Facebook, and you talk to people through Facebook, and you consume all of your content through Facebook. And if you click on to a website, it's because you saw it on Facebook, and they present it in Facebook.
Facebook, the operating system.
It basically is Facebook, the operating system. It was a genius move on their part. It gives me the heebie-jeebies. But it was a genius move on their part. And they're going to keep doing this because they want to own as much of their time as you can. And Facebook is particularly adept at this, and Twitter is okay at it, and LinkedIn is terrible at it. So you'll see varying degrees of skill at actually owning your time there. But they are going to be very, very aggressive about it. So whatever it is you're offering as far as content or a service, if it's compelling and it's something these people are interested in, they will find a way to make it be presented through their medium. And even if they don't do anything for it, consider that whatever your service is or your content is, whoever reaches it may very well have been filtered through what someone else said about it. So if someone finds your stuff through Twitter, you had no control over what the context was of how they got there. You have no control over exactly where they were sent or what the person said about you ahead of time or what they told them to do or what they told them to buy. You have no control. The interesting thing to just kind of make your peace with as devices become more prevalent and the means of this kind of, the means of accessing the web grows and becomes more disparate, is that you are not in control. You can offer up things and people will get them how they'd like. And that is just the way it's going to be, unless you try real hard to clamp down on it and you're doing yourself a great disservice if you do. Yes?
So an example of that, from what I understand, if you have Comcast at home, they insert little pieces of code into the web pages you view.
Yeah, they do that. There's actually a few providers who will do that or have started trying to do that, and it's almost always in the guise of, well, we need to be able to tell you when you're about to run out of bandwidth or bits or something along those lines. And really, it's, we want to get you used to this so that when we start injecting our own ads, you'll be like, yeah, okay, this is all right. But they have started doing that, and there's usually a pretty big backlash, but they'll just keep doing it until there's not. So you got to start with your content. You got to layer in everything else. Content is king. Everything you layer on top of that is gravy. Is you trying to take over as much of the presentation of it as you can because you want to ensure a decent experience, but you're never going to get all the way there. Responsive prototyping is also about doing practical design reviews. So design reviews are definitely something that is to some extent limited to sort of a design kind of goofy role. But design reviews historically have been, I have designed this beautiful page, and it is, it is going to look gorgeous on someone's Retina MacBook Pro, and I will maybe print that out or I'll put it up on some big TV or something along those lines, and other people will come and they will review it and they will say this is good and this is bad and we will make some changes. And that is a traditional design review. It usually starts with something like this, which granted is probably much more familiar to anybody who does visual design or anything like that. It says this is what happens when you make a new document in Photoshop. You just say, hey, it's 1,000 pixels wide and it's 900 pixels high, because that's been the size that you use when you're building a web page for everything for the last like 15 years. And it just feels super comfortable and familiar and it's just great. Well, it's absolutely not good enough. It's just not good enough at all. See, I actually don't usually get a lot of laughs with this, which makes me sad. But I think this is a slightly more Star Trek friendly crowd. So that works really well. And every now and then I'll get really bold and I'll try to do like my Picard impression, but Ryan, who I came with from ZURB, is like the biggest Trekkie I think I've ever met, and if I screwed it up, I wouldn't hear the end of it. So, anyways. But he's more of a Kirk guy, he's more of an original series guy, so he would be like, it's not good enough. Something like that, right? Yeah.
Not good enough, damn it, not good enough.
See, that was pretty solid. But anyways, it's just not good enough. To build something that is going to look great on someone's laptop, you can't do that. You need to test something here, you need to try it here, you need to try it here, and everywhere else that you can, basically, to see if your design, to see if your code, to see if your presentation or your interaction or your layout or what have you is going to work in a way that is acceptable to most people. And you can't test it everywhere, but you have to try to see it in as many ways as you can to really understand how this works. Yes?
So I noticed you had an iPhone, an iPad, and a 27-inch. You didn't do the 55-inch TV.
I did not. I have a slight Apple bias in the things that I present. I used to work for Apple, and my wife worked for Apple. So you'll see a lot of Apple devices in my presentation. I'm very sorry. There are other devices out there.
Okay.
A 55-inch TV is a totally legit thing to actually consider. In fact, we just had installed at our office 2 80-inch TVs, which are awesome. And it looks really strange to pull up a website on one of those because it's just like the type is like the size of your head. It's really cool, actually. But you do need to think through like all of these different devices. I pulled out iPhones and iPads and iMacs because I think in Apple terms. But there are a lot of things that you should try out. And we actually have at ZURB, we have a bank of about 12 or 15 or so just testing devices, which covers everything from old Android and Windows phones and tablets all the way up to newer hardware. Yes?
Would you actually want to use the 80-inch TV because you're effectively, you've got to deal with the phone screen because that's a very small screen that you're going to be fairly close looking at it, and the letters have to cover a fairly large portion of the screen, whereas on the big, large, I'm not sure what the large display you have up there, you're going to have letters that are a very, very small percentage of the screen, and so aren't those actually, so wouldn't you actually skip the 80-inch because it's just going to be something that has larger text, but it's actually going to be within the range of
the thing that's very interesting, there is some truth to that, which is that an 80-inch TV you can usually gloss over to some extent because it's going to be very similar to some other things that you're doing. The interesting thing is that actually there's not that much difference, bizarrely, between what you see on your phone and what you see on an 80-inch TV because it's a matter of how far you are from the device. So if I'm this close to my phone, which is fairly normal because I'm a little blind, this is actually about as big as an 80-inch TV if the 80-inch TV is on that back wall. So it's remarkably similar, you'll actually find. There's very few devices that really, if you think about it consciously while you're going through your day, you'll find there are very few screens that you look at that are wildly differently sized than another one you were looking at to you. Because you tend to use them at the distance that makes them a comfortable screen size for you from that distance. So the distance you work on your phone or you look at your phone is probably closer than you would look at on a tablet. That's probably closer than you look at from your laptop, and it's probably closer than you sit to a TV. The disparity between them is not enormous. What actually becomes the biggest limiting factor is that, it's funny, the biggest limiting factor for actually designing for a phone, bizarrely, the screen size plays some role in it because it is a small screen. The biggest factor is actually that our fingers are fat. The actual granularity of interaction and granularity of what you can do is much, much lower on a phone because our fingers are not cursors. They're not pointed, unless you have like really scary nails or something. But those are capacitive, so they don't work. So that doesn't get you anywhere either. But it is interesting. You don't have to test on everything that you have. It's worthwhile, at least it acclimates you to what it is you actually have to be aware of. So it's worthwhile to test on a lot of different things. TVs less so still. TVs are becoming more prevalent as interactive tools. And actually some of the newer smart TVs are pretty crazy, frankly, with what they can do. But it's a big field. So responsive prototyping lets you basically prototype for almost every device fairly quickly. You cut down significantly on your development. If you're building one code base as opposed to 100, it's going to be a bit faster. Even if the one takes you a little bit longer than one somewhere else might have. And you're ready for devices that don't exist yet. Nobody here has an iPhone 6. Nobody here has a Samsung Galaxy S9 or what have you, whatever's next. But they will happen. They will come out. They will be a little bit different. They might be a lot different. And you can be more or less ready for that because they don't change that dramatically yet. There'll be a time when it might become more obvious. But you can be ready for devices that don't exist yet. So to get all this done, we needed some new tools. Some new tools that kind of pop up. And the tools came from a very small starting point. So they came from fairly quickly. We actually got here pretty quickly. This article was written by a guy named Ethan Marcotte, or Ethan Marcotte. I think he says Marcotte, but I'm sure it's Ethan Marcotte. Called Responsive Web Design. He published it in a list apart. This was about 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. It's 3 years ago next month. And he outlined basically this is what responsive web design should be. This is how it should work. It should be a flexible, powerful, fluid grid system. So a means of laying out a page or an interface that is easy to assemble and will reasonably handle different size screens and different size aspect ratios and things like that. It's styles for media, so images or movies or what have you, that doesn't really worry about pixels because pixels are now irrelevant. If you ask most people, I know you guys are not most people, if you ask most people, they couldn't tell you what the resolution of their phone is. I can tell you what the resolution of this phone is. I can tell you what the resolution of probably most of your devices was. I just don't care. The actual pixel size of these things has become academic to some extent. And then it's media queries, which I'll explain a little bit what that is if you're not big into CSS. Media queries to selectively adapt the page. Basically what that means is a mechanism by which you can serve up different things for different devices. And it's a facet of CSS. So that was a start. He outlined kind of what responsive was, but we really needed some tools, and we needed a lot of tested elements, things like navigation, or tabs, or forms, or buttons, or typography. We basically needed all the bits and pieces and assembling building blocks of what it is we wanted to put together in order for this to really, really be feasible. And that is why we built Foundation. And now I will talk more about Foundation because it's very near and dear to my heart. But I would be remiss in not pointing out, so Foundation actually itself is foundation.zurb.com. It's MIT licensed, so it's about as free as we can possibly make it. I think you can do just about anything with it, actually. I'd appreciate it if you didn't just straight up try to sell it, but you can do pretty much anything else. There are a number of frameworks actually out there now that are more or less quote-unquote responsive design, responsive frameworks. Bootstrap you may have heard of, which is our primary competitor. I actually know the guy. Bootstrap's actually a super nice guy, and I won't say mean things about him. I'll say mean things about Bootstrap, but not him. There are a number of frameworks, but Foundation is the one that we made. You can pull it up on whatever device you happen to have handy. Again, all Apple devices, I'm sorry. But what you'll actually find in Foundation is basically a series of building blocks, a series of things that we knew we needed and we assumed that other people needed, and I think we've been proven true with it, to build something responsive, to build a responsive web interface quickly, to prototype something quickly and then carry that through to production code without having to worry too much about how some of it works or how to QA a whole lot of it across all these different devices and browsers and what have you. And there's a lot of just components, and you're welcome to poke around at it. In fact, usually, this is actually kind of bizarre. Usually when I do talks like this, as soon as I put like a URL up on the board, like everyone's eyes down, like immediately. Everyone's just like, ooh, okay, I can poke around with my phone now. You guys are actually like still looking at me. It's actually a little bit odd, honestly. I'm a little weirded out.
You've been on URLs for a year or two.
Okay, cool. All right, excellent. So you've seen these before. But you're welcome to poke around at it whenever you'd like. The documentation has basically everything listed. I'm going to touch on some of the highlights just because it kind of elucidates how a framework like this works and why it might be useful to you. But frameworks like this are what actually enable rapid responsive prototyping. If you have to do all this from scratch every time, you just can't. It's just not fast enough. There's too much to build. There's too much to do. And the pace of technology in general and the web specifically gets faster like every month. It's just out of control. Actually, this is a sufficiently nerdy crowd. I could actually ask any like singularitarians in the room. Ray Kurzweil, singularity stuff. Yeah. If you believe him, then it's just going to get faster and faster until we just can't keep up and everything goes bananas. But it is getting faster for sure. And frameworks are what's actually going to help you keep up to some extent because you can rely on someone else to do some of the ground level heavy lifting. And rapid responsive prototyping helps us make better products because you can't just design something on paper, or design something in Photoshop, or draft something up as a wireframe and go build it and it's done. It has to be seen in all the different places it's going to be seen. It has to work in all the different places that it has to work. So you have to prototype this stuff responsibly. You have to actually prototype things where you can play with them on different devices. And you can understand, can you use this with a mouse? Can you use this with your finger? Can you use this? Do you have to pinch the screen around and do all kinds of crazy shenanigans? Is this useful for someone if they're on their phone? The example I love to throw out of really rapid prototyping is, does anyone know what the first prototype of the iPod was? Yes.
Piece of wood.
It was a block of wood. It was a block of wood, a little bit shorter than this and a little bit fatter than this, about the size of the original iPod. And Steve Jobs carried it around for weeks, just in his pocket. And anytime he would think, man, I wish I was listening to music, he would take it out of his pocket and he would pretend that he was picking a song on it and put it back in his pocket because he wanted to get a feel for what did it mean to carry around something that heavy and that size all the time. He actually got the idea from Paul, I'm going to forget his name, that's what I was trying to remember. I can't remember his name either. Who did the same thing. He carried around a block of wood for some of the first Palm Pilots because that was a totally new thing. So like, what did it mean to carry around something that heavy? That's rapid prototyping. That's for a physical product, obviously. For the web, you need something to enable a little bit more functionality than that. That's not to say that you can't prototype on paper. You can. You can prototype by sketching. You do it all the time. And to responsibly prototype, you need some tools. So, Foundation. How does it work? What do we get? Is it awesome? Obviously, it's awesome. But how does it actually work? I'm going to touch on just some of the bigger pieces. And the biggest one that everyone kind of sees or knows or comes to love, I hope, is what's called the grid. And the grid is what enables you to build a layout, basically. The grid, and it's based on the concept of the typographic grid, which is a design construct basically for laying out a page in columns, so you can maintain consistency and hierarchy. What it really is it's a 12-column grid, so you imagine whatever screen you're on and divvy it up into 12 slices. It's fluid, so it's all percentage-based. So the columns are blah pixels wide, they are a percentage wide. They're 12 columns, they're 8.3 repeating percent wide. And there's some gutters between them. And it's modified by media queries. So what media queries do, if you're not big into CSS, I'm big into CSS, I love CSS. If you're not big into CSS, a media query is a block that you can wrap a bunch of styles in that says only apply these styles if the following criteria are met. The screen is at least this wide. The orientation is landscape. The DPI density is 2 or greater. Things like that. So what we do is we use media queries with the grid to say the grid should behave certain ways depending on various qualities of the device that you're on. So if you build your layout using the grid, and I'll show you kind of how that works, you can rely on the media queries that are already in place to make it reasonably play nice with a lot of different kinds of devices. You can go further, and you should. You can nest it, so you can have rows inside of columns, inside of rows, inside of columns, inside of rows, inside of columns, and it gets divvied up into 12 every time. So you can very easily imagine how you can get pretty complex layouts if you have basically 12 columns to work with all the time. Don't worry about this. It uses a different box model, but you don't care because you don't care about CSS box models. It uses a different box model. If you care about that, you can ask me afterwards. It's neat, but most people don't care. It looks like this. Is everyone here at least passingly familiar with HTML? Yes, all right, excellent. Nobody raised their hands. I was going to be like, well, the rest of this is very boring. But it looks like this. You create rows, and inside those rows you put columns, and you determine how many of the 12 columns you have you want that block to occupy. So what this does is it says, all right, I want, and ignore the syntax for the moment. That's a vestige of how Foundation 4 works, and I can explain that in a minute. But what it means is I want to use 3 columns for one block, and I want to use 9 columns for the other. Out of 12, you can do the math. That's 1/4 and 3/4. That's 25% and 75%. So the row looks something like this, and it has an arbitrary max width, so it doesn't get huge on really big displays. And then I've got 3 columns and 9 columns. And whatever I put into those columns is whatever I put into those columns. They will grow in height to accommodate whatever gets dumped into them. But if I wanted a page that was a left-hand sidebar and a right-hand content space, this is how I would do it. I would do 3 columns, and I would do 9 columns. I could add another row that has 3 columns and 2 columns and 7 columns. And I could add another row that has 10 columns and 2 columns. And you can just keep building out rows and columns, and you can start to see how you could build a reasonably complex layout using just these fairly simple classes. But it gets really cool when you start nesting rows. So let's say I take this column and I put a row in here. And inside that row, I put 10 columns and 2 columns. And then I put another row that has 4 columns and 8 columns. And now we're kind of off to the races. Now we can do some pretty interesting stuff. We can put avatars next to bios that are part of a sidebar, that are part of a main content space, that has columns that are next to each other for text and video and what have you. So you can do some fairly fascinating stuff. This page is an ugly, granted, example of something that was just very, very rapidly prototyped with Foundation. We do something every year at ZURB called ZURB Wired, where we pick a local nonprofit and we go for 24 straight hours, 8 a.m. to 8 a.m., and we redo all of their stuff. We give them a new website, new print collateral, new everything. And incidentally, we take volunteers, so if you're interested in staying up all night, by all means. It's pretty fun, and by about 3 or 4 a.m., you'll find that people get really interesting. But we did this very, very quickly to prototype a website for a nonprofit called Rebecca Children's Services, which was a couple years ago. And this is built entirely with the grid and just really, really basic Foundation components. And this is from a couple versions of Foundation ago, so it's a little old. But this whole left-hand section is 8 columns. This is just one big 8-column block. And inside that, we have nested rows. So this is a row which has 2 columns and 10 columns, and that's how we do an icon next to a description of a service that's part of a larger main content space. So you can see how that kind of starts to work. And then if you're paying close attention, you've noticed that I just showed you all of these on larger screens. There are various things that can happen on smaller screens by default in Foundation. The simplest of all is that we take the grid and we linearize it, which I've never been entirely sure is a word, but I keep using it as one, so I'm just going to keep doing it. We essentially take the columns and we stack them. We say that they are no longer columns, they're just blocks. And you'd actually be surprised. 9 times out of 10, this gets you a lot of the way to actually something that is passably usable on a very small device. It doesn't get you all the way there by any means, but it gets you some of the way there. There is also a mobile grid, so you can actually still use the grid. When you saw the syntax I showed you before, it was like large 3, large 9. I could have said like small 6, and that would mean on small device it's going to be 6 columns and 6 columns instead of 3 and 9, where I could have done whatever I wanted. If you only specify the large size, it will only be that on larger screens. And with Foundation, we defined an arbitrary, what's called a breakpoint, where we basically say that anything that's essentially smaller than an iPad is a phone. Anything that's larger than an iPad is a larger screen. You can build things with Foundation, and you should, that have many more breakpoints. You can do a vastly adaptable layout from a very small screen to a very large screen and have different things that take effect at different stages, but not by default. And the syntax all looks like this: large column, large 2 columns, large 3 columns. You can have columns that are offset so they get pushed over. You can have columns that are centered. You can have columns that are both one size on large and one size on smaller screens. So it's pretty flexible. There is, I hope, reasonably readable documentation for this on the Foundation website. I say I hope because I can read it, but hopefully others can too. And like I said, there's a large and small grid, so it's 12 columns for both that you can use. The small columns roll up, so if you say that something is small 3, small 9, it'll also be large 3, large 9. Large columns don't roll down. Because Foundation 4 is built in what's called mobile first, so everything that you build should be the mobile presentation first, and then you basically add complexity as screens get larger, rather than reducing it when you get smaller. Mobile first is cool, and I could talk all night about that, but I won't, because my wife will kill me. Yes?
I was just looking at that last slide. I just noticed at the last moment, it said large-1 dot column. Is it actually that way, or should it actually be large column?
Actually does both. I'm a grammar nut, so it drove me crazy if I wrote large 1 columns. So you can actually write both. Good eye.
Well, it was a case, wait a minute, this does not match most programming languages, so what's going on here?
This one was written by a designer. And I didn't like writing 1 columns, so I did what I wanted. But yes, you can write column or columns. Of course, you can also write 9 column. That made me very sad. Yeah, that would work too. Please don't. Please.
We'll write 1 columns and 9 column.
I will
all the time. Just
find you and I will hurt you. All right. So that's the grid in a nutshell. I'll show you some other examples of just how it works, but that's the grid in a nutshell. And the grid is one of the. It's certainly not the largest component of the foundation. There's actually things we had to write a lot more code for, frankly. But the grid is the one that most people kind of see and they go, "Aha! I can use this, and this will be helpful, and this will help me build things," and you can wrap your head around it reasonably quickly. If you are going to be building web-based interfaces and you are interested in them being responsive, and I think that you should, play around with it. There's perfectly good documentation, tutorials, and what have you around there. There's a question in the back, and there's one here. Yes?
Not to ask too much for something that's free, is there a graphical user interface, front end for this?
Oh, to actually build it?
Where you can actually draw, instead of writing how many columns, actually draw it on the screen?
We are actually working on something like that. It is a remarkably tricky problem, but I think we've kind of solved it. If you want an example of hastily building a graphical interface for something like this and then realizing that it's such real bad, I invite you to look at something called Jetstrap, which was built for Bootstrap, and try to build something with that. And then after you're done tearing out your hair, it's a fairly tricky problem. We are working on something there, but not just yet. And then, yes, there's.
So how's it different from frames or someone more to the concept?
It's definitely an evolution. Typographic grids have been around for a long time. And like column grids, yeah, like frames, or you're getting back to like 960GS or Blueprint or some of the older just straight up grid systems. This is definitely an evolution of that. The biggest changes that we've made is, well, there's a lot of changes under the hood for just how grids are actually rendered now, which is largely academic and you won't really care if you're writing the code. But I care. It's just the responsive nature of it. It's doing things fluidly. It's doing things that actually respond to unique queries. It's being smart about how things are going to be contained and then nesting and stuff like that. The grid in and of itself, if you just looked at the grid foundation, is not like a vastly different animal than something like Blueprint or something like some of the older grid systems used to be. It's the other components that we build on top of it that essentially do set it apart. But the grid is extraordinarily useful. It's definitely the piece that most people are like, yes, the grid, give me that. In fact, there's plenty of people who use Foundation and they just strip out everything but the grid, which hurts a little, but it happens all the time. I hope I answered that. There's a question back there.
So just to be clear, if I design in your foundation, it not only works just fine on Apple products, but it also works just fine on Android products?
Yes, it works just fine on Android product. Yes, I have quite an Apple bias when I show things. We actually tested pretty much everywhere. Believe it or not, it'll actually work on like a Windows phone or a Surface or I think even any BlackBerry after 6 or various things.
Even though Microsoft is notoriously non-compliant with websites? So
I will give you this. Foundation 4, which is the latest incarnation, only works in IE 9 and up. Foundation 3 worked in IE 8 and up, and Foundation 2 worked in IE 7 and up. None of them ever worked in IE 6.
Okay.
Because I just wasn't going to do that. We keep pushing it ahead, and there's technical reasons why we drop support for various versions of IE. The reason we dropped IE 8, actually the only reason we dropped IE 8 is because IE 8 doesn't support media queries. So we can't do the things that we need to do with media queries and have it work in IE8. So that was just kind of a, well, we can either not support IE8 or we can build something that sucks. But IE9 and up is fine. And actually 9 and 10 have really reasonably quick adoption if you're outside enterprise. So we haven't run into huge problems with it. We get a lot of requests for, could you please make this work in IE8? And the answer will continue to be no. But it works in both places. We do test it quite a bit.
You say mobile first, but you also said that you linearize from the larger one to mobile.
It's a little bit of a lie. What we actually do is that we take what is linear when you build it and we essentially gridderize it as you go up. That's definitely not a word. Some of this is because a lot of how I try to introduce this is still based on how we did things in Foundation 3. Foundation 4 has only been out for a few weeks. So we're still kind of wrapping our heads around some of those. What really happens in Foundation now is that you build the mobile presentation, which is largely linear. It doesn't have to be, but it's largely linear. And then you basically say, as the screen gets larger, I want it to inherit these particular grid sizes so that it becomes more complex as you go up. It's progressive enhancement instead of graceful degradation. But yes, that is a good point. I'm slightly fibbing as I show some of this stuff. I can't tell if you have a question or if you're stroking your okay. He was really intensely stroking his beard and every now and then doing this, and I was like, is it a question? No, I'm embarrassed him. I'm very sorry. So really quickly, I'll touch on some of the other things. Images in Foundation, or really any responsive framework, are basically with whatever. To some extent, and I could talk about optimization, but to some extent, you don't really care what size your image is going to be. You can't, because you don't know. Images will be constrained by the size of the grid that you drop them into, and the grid will change its size based on the screen, and it'll be in a percentage, and it'll probably be a weird pixel size anyway. It drives people crazy because the default Foundation grid, if you just look at it like 1,000 pixels wide, if you try to mock that up in Photoshop, all of your columns are 53.3 pixels wide. It makes people nuts. No, it's if you do 1,200. There's some number. It was driving someone crazy earlier today. They were really mad at me. But you can't really worry about what size your media is going to be. You have to kind of give up that control. So all the images in a responsive design, they have to be able to scale for different devices. You can either make them large enough to handle big displays, which is a heavy load. You don't really want to send a 4,000 pixel wide image down to a phone. It's just not necessary. But you can do it that way. You can just make huge images and they'll just work everywhere. They'll just be big. Or you can do something crafty, like use, there's a solution out there now called Picture Fill from Scott Jelly, works for Filament Group. There's a link to it on Github if you're so inclined, which essentially is a JavaScript polyfill for doing what the picture element will eventually do. What it lets you do is it says, here's the mobile image, and then JavaScript goes, can you accept a larger image? Cool, here you go. So it's actually pretty crafty and it's reasonably easy to use. It's probably the best of the solutions that exist right now because there is no native solution for this. And then everything else in Foundation is like other components, and I'm going to blitz through these, there's just a ton of other stuff in there, because you need these just sort of reusable chunks when you want to build something. You need typography, you need headers, and you need paragraphs, and you need links, and you need lists, and you need things of that nature, and we have all of those. Forms, if you're big into HTML or CSS, laying out forms sucks. We have hopefully made that at least somewhat less painful by essentially just building out a scheme where you can actually use the grid to lay out the form. So you can do rows and columns and stuff that'll basically size all of your inputs and size all the stuff that you need. So you can do pretty complex form layouts without wishing you were dead. I know that looks really complicated. It's actually not nearly as complicated as it looks. It's just grid columns inside rows, and they have inputs inside them. It's actually pretty simple. Things like putting labels in front of a form, or putting you actually use the grid for that as well. Or putting buttons after them. And speaking of buttons, I love buttons. We really love buttons at ZURB. I'm not sure why. But if you just need buttons, and everybody needs buttons, you just throw a class on an anchor called button, and it becomes a button. And there's secondary buttons, and radius buttons that have nice little rounded edges, and alert round buttons, which are red and are all rounded, and there's a whole bunch of classes like that. So it's just useful. There's it's a smorgasbord of tools, and there's tabs and navigation bars and the various things that you need to kind of prototype something. And we actually take it through to production code pretty much every time. We don't just prototype in Foundation and then toss it. The code is reasonably light. It's not as light as we could make it. We're still working on it, but it's pretty light. It won't crush devices. It's actually pretty svelte. There's just a few examples that I have of sites that were built with it. This is one called Flight. This is an agency that built it. They actually did a really good job of mapping all of this across the different devices. I know they're all Apple devices, I'm sorry. But they work on other devices too. Felix, this was actually a client of ours, but we show it off because we thought it was pretty cool looking. You can see how some of this stuff works a little differently. I mean, the image obviously is cropped a little differently when you get down to smaller screens, and some of these things like the navigation changes fairly dramatically, and there's some bigger changes that happen. That's all built on Foundation. A really quick look at, this was actually the ZURB wired site for this past year for Family Giving Tree. This was all built in Foundation and all built within the span of 24 hours. So we essentially sketched everything out, and then within 2 hours we had taken the sketches for like 20, 25 pages and turned them into just Foundation code. It took about 2 hours. And then, granted, it took another 8 to go from that to a finished looking site. But still, considering it actually came together pretty well, it was pretty fast. And we could never have done that without Foundation, without a framework that enabled us to do things fairly quickly. And it came together pretty well. It's, the mobile thing looks better as you scroll, but it's definitely catching on. Responsive is actually a pretty big thing now. You've probably seen sites that do this. You're probably not all You're probably not all obsessive like me. Anytime I see a redesign for a site, I just grab the edge of the browser and I go to see if it's actually responsive or not. That's just me. But like Read Write Web, they just recently, or Read Write, which is also Read Write Web and other things. They redesigned, it's all responsive. Smashing Magazine, if you know that one, actually has a really interesting and very complete responsive implementation. I wish they built it with Foundation. They did it custom, which was probably painful. But it's really, really well done, and you should take a look at it. But this is a pretty big thing now, so it's definitely catching on. You got a question?
Yes, dynamic content, tables made on the fly, graphs made on the fly, org charts.
Mm-hmm. They work just fine. Everything that we've written, especially in the later versions of Foundation, we rewrote all the JavaScript just to make sure that it doesn't choke on dynamically injected or generated content. Layout-wise, it'll all work pretty well. The one caveat I'll give you is that tables are absolutely still the Achilles heel of web presentation on small devices. There is just not a way to take an actual table element and really restructure it into something that is usable and works like a table on a small device. It's just a sucky format for a small screen. There's about 10 different solutions out there. We wrote one, which we keep on what's called our playground. It's just called responsive tables, which is interesting, although I don't think it works for everything. Tables are a pain in the ass. Everything else, though, I mean, dynamically generated content should be no problem. Foundation is actually extraordinarily agnostic about what you build with it. Foundation is almost entirely, really is entirely, a front-end framework. It's CSS and HTML and JavaScript. It doesn't really care what you build it on. It doesn't really care how you build your pages. We build Rails apps mostly. We've seen it used with Node or anything else. There's all kinds of stuff out there that works with this pretty well. So I've talked a lot about sort of like what we're doing right now. I'm going to touch on a little bit of what's next. And I'm going to, again, do this fairly quickly, but it's definitely the most exciting part for me. I get really, really amped about this stuff. So what are we still going to have? First things first, better media support. Media is a killer on mobile devices right now because there's just no good solution for serving the right media to the right device. They're all painful. Picture fill, the one I told you about, is I think the least painful of the bunch, and it's still a little weird. But like you get into things like device profiling, and I swear you'll just wish you were dead. The picture element will eventually happen, and we'll solve this, but that's probably 2 or 3 years out realistically, so we can't really wait. There is a rising prevalence of things like SVG. I was actually having a conversation just before this about SVG, which the interesting thing with SVG, which is scalable vector graphics, is that they are extraordinarily portable and they are extraordinarily useful for responsive design. They are still a gigantic pain to create. You actually make them in the right format so that they work everywhere and they're actually like done correctly and they show up. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you how to do it. I have to go look it up again. It's just a pain. But they are becoming more and more prevalent. You can do really interesting things with SVG. You can actually embed media queries inside SVG, which is fascinating. You can have an image that actually changes the image as the device characteristics change. It's really cool. But again, really technically challenging and weird. Yes?
So that's despite the fact that there's only a handful of graphics hardware vendors in the world, and apparently they don't want to talk to one another at all.
The different... and browsers have historically all implemented different sort of draft or vaguely evolving specs of SVG over time. So there's many different ways that they can actually be presented, and to actually get them to work everywhere, you kind of need an altering solution that creates one SVG to rule them all, as it were. Which is extraordinarily stupidly, frustratingly challenging. Even like the big boys, like I don't even think I can actually export an SVG from Illustrator, which is like $700 software, and have it work in more than like 1 or 2 places. It's really dumb. So it's kind of a pain in the neck. It will become less painful because it's a need, and SVG works very well when it's working. So it will get better, but it's going to take a little bit of time. There will be better and more advanced frameworks. I obviously would, I'm going to skip over box settings. Like I said, you don't care. All the major frameworks now are using preprocessors. If you don't like CSS very much, you might like it more if you use a preprocessor with it, because it's pretty cool and it lets you do some of the more programming kind of things with CSS than usually you can do. Like build functions and nest things and have rules and variables and stuff like that you couldn't traditionally do in CSS. We use Sass with Foundation, and Sass is definitely the most developer-friendly, I think, of the two. Sass and Less are kind of the two the big players. Sass, from everything I've heard, is destined for the chopping block, so I would avoid it. But Sass is like Less. Less is, yeah. Did I say Sass?
Yes.
My bad. Less. I'm not, yes. We use Sass. Sass is good. Less, from everything I've heard, is destined for the chopping block. He's doing his own thing, and he doesn't really care anymore, and the Sass team is pretty motivated. So, yes, you had a question.
Yeah. So is the Foundation framework, is it for the novices of CSS or the time savers, or would you recommend that anyone who wants to be responsive and is advanced in CSS needs to know?
You definitely don't have to be advanced. We tried to write it in such a way, and some of the preprocessor stuff, and you'll see it in the documentation, there's a lot of stuff about like mix-ins and things like that. You don't really have to mess with that. If you know how to write markup, if you know how to write HTML, strictly speaking, you could build Foundation prototype and not touch CSS at all. You actually don't have to. To finalize stuff, you do. You don't really want your stuff to just look like Foundation out of the box, because it doesn't look, it deliberately doesn't look great. It looks bare, which is what we wanted, because we customize it every time, and we want people to customize it. But you don't need to be a pro to use some of the stuff. The documentation is pretty solid. There's a lot of examples. If you know your way around markup and you know how to put classes on things, you're good.
And what I'm asking is for someone who is an advanced CSS.
Well, I use it and I wrote it.
Does the grid handle like every kind of layout you can use?
The grid handles, I would say that the things that I build, the grid gets me like 95% of the way. I use it as a starting point every time. I will do other things to it, and I know my way around it, so I'll kind of bend it to my will and do some weird stuff to it. If you are like an advanced, front-end programmer and stuff, I don't think you'll look at Foundation and be like, this is play school, and toss it aside. It's pretty legit, or at least I think it is. Mobile first and semantic markup are both cool things that I could talk for a really long time about, but I won't, because I'm sure everybody has things they need to do. But they are both paradigms, I suppose, I hate using that word, paradigms, that are becoming more prevalent. Mobile first, I've talked a little bit about. Semantic markup just means that you don't actually have to put presentational classes into your HTML. You don't have to put like large 9 columns. You can write whatever classes make the most sense from a sort of like a readability perspective and attach those after the fact using Sass. It's actually really cool if you're really into like clean markup. Semantic markup is really neat and has now been made possible through preprocessors like Sass or Less. So it's pretty cool. And then this one, you'll like this one actually. And actually, I forget who was specifically that asked me about like a GUI for this. But this will get you the closest you're going to get. Is actually Adobe, of all people, who spent so long trying to convince us all that no, Flash is cool, guys. Seriously, Flash. Finally got their head out of the sand and started doing some interesting things, the most interesting of which is what's called Edge Reflow, Adobe Edge Reflow. I am both really excited about Reflow and a little bit sad about Reflow, because at some point Reflow is going to get good enough that frameworks like Foundation just aren't necessary. What Reflow essentially lets you do is to WYSIWYG build a page, define all the breakpoints, and move things at those particular breakpoints, and they will generate the code for you. And the nice thing that separates it apart from like Dreamweaver, which did this too, it sucked, is that they actually generate good code. It actually does it like the right way. They did a demo of this for us a few months ago, and we gave them a little bit of feedback, and there's like there's a beta of it now. If you have an Adobe, whatever they call it, cloud, something or other, you can grab it. It's actually pretty cool. It's actually pretty good software. It's going to be really interesting. This is a way that's going to let people build responsive sites that you don't have to really write any code at all. So. That'll be very cool. It's not there yet, so you still need foundation. But it'll get there. The whole suite, actually, of Edge stuff is reasonably interesting. So that's soon. That's what's coming up like reasonably soon. So what's next? What's like next? And this is where I get really excited. It's the shortest part of the preso, but it's really cool because it gets my head going. Everybody knows what this is, right? Come on, everybody knows what this is. Everybody knows Iron Man. Yeah, everybody knows Iron Man. I love these movies, and I love screens like this because I like to pick apart like all the little things that they kind of like build into it. It's like, oh, he's got rockets and stuff. It's cool. Like you look at stuff like this, you look at tech like this, and you're like, oh, that's gotta be like that's way out there and stuff like that. That's crazy. HUDs are not crazy. Like having a presentational layer in front of your face is not crazy at all. In fact, it's right now. It's literally right now. And I'll give you a very silly example of how excited I actually am about this, despite the fact that it's going to make me look like a huge dork.
Is this from Apple?
Hmm?
Is this from Apple?
No, this is actually from Google, believe it or not. It's from Google. This is Google Glass. If you haven't seen it, actually.
I just had to hear you admit that.
I know. Okay, here, legitimately. It works better with Android phones, and I swear to God, I sat there like yesterday morning, I thought, can I use an Android phone? And I was this close. But actually, I got into their like Glass Explorer programs. I don't have them yet, but I will have them. And for the last like 5 days, everyone in my office has been making a huge amount of fun of me because I actually took the step of, they don't work with glasses, so I went and got contacts. Like, I went to the optometrist and I was like, I need contacts because I need to be able to use Google Glass. So I showed up at work looking like this, which means everyone comes to me and goes, you look weird. Which is really sad because it's like, it's my actual face. And it makes me a little, I feel a little sad about it.
Have you glued a block to your glasses?
They are.
Have you glued a little block to your glasses?
Have I glued a little block to my glasses? I haven't gone quite that level of fanboy, but maybe I'm getting there. Depends on how long it takes to get the things. They are working on a prescription one, but I can't wait. Come on, I can't wait. But having a screen in front of you is like, this is like here and now. And the interesting thing is actually what they display on this little block of glass is HTML. It's HTML, CSS. There's templates and stuff you can play with. It's HTML. So it is, in a very real sense, a pseudo-responsive implementation in that what they are showing could theoretically be shown in other places and still work. In fact, they show it on the web. The playground for it is a web page. It's a page where you can play around with how to build an interface for glassware, they call it. And you actually remember these movies, like he's just talking to his suit the whole time, right? He's like, Jarvis, I need to da-da-da-da-da. God, such a nerd. Talking to your hardware is actually also not far-fetched. With some degree of accuracy, you can talk to some of your hardware and how to do things. I actually put Siri up here as an example because I'm a huge Apple fan. But actually, from everything I hear, Android actually has kind of an edge there. With Google now, it's actually a bit better than Siri's doing. And the other big thing from like Iron Man stuff, like all these holograms, right? There's like holographic interfaces for all this kind of stuff. Dude, you can rap with holograms now. This is from Coachella like 2 years ago. This was hologram Tupac. That's a hologram, and that's Snoop. It was totally like just showy and ridiculous and like technology for the most egregious of silly uses. But it was pretty legit. If you actually see it, it was like it's crazy. Snoop was rapping with a hologram. It's crazy. And like you've probably seen Google self-driving cars. They tool around Mountain View and stuff. Think about how are people going to use the services you do when they're in their car. Like I actually wish I brought the screen with me. A guy that we know at ZURB, he got one of those Tesla S's, the brand new Mac Daddy Teslas. Dude, the screen in that thing on the dash is bigger than my laptop. It's out of control. It's like this, and it has a web browser. It has an actual legit web browser, which immediately made me think, could you pull up like Netflix and just be watching a movie while you drive? Because that can't be good. But it's an actual web browser. But if you're riding around in your car and the car's driving itself, like you will be interacting with the technology around you. You will be using whatever's in the car or whatever's in your hand. Whatever it is you're doing, whatever it is you're working on, people are going to eventually use that in their car. So what does that look like? How's that going to work? This is responsive design. This is responsive design. It's not just web design. It's responsive design because the things that we're working on now have to work everywhere because everywhere is going to be everything. There are going to be screens and what have you and various ways of interacting with stuff and holograms and law. We look back at this in 10 years, we're going to be like, holy crap. We had no idea it was going to be this crazy. And the best thing we can do now is to try to get ready for that by trying to be responsive about things. Yes?
So instead of querying to see what the screen size is roughly, then would it be something like query to see this is in auto command, verbal command mode versus?
Absolutely. There will almost certainly be media queries for the device characteristics that are like accepts audio input or accepts, gestural input or what have you. It'll keep getting augmented, I'm absolutely certain. Yes?
I'm going to plug our meeting again tomorrow night on AR
Augmented reality.
Designing for augmented reality.
I actually really wish I could go to that because I went to an AR conference like 3 years ago or 2 years ago, and I would love to see what's happened since then because I was super disappointed because I went to like a few sessions and it was like, the future of AR is printing out a marker and putting it on a table and looking at it with a camera and seeing a teapot. I was like, I'm sure there's cooler stuff now, but I'd be curious to see how that goes. It's interesting that the Google Glass stuff is actually not really considered AR because they're not going to try to do any of that out of the gate. But I think there's some opportunity there. It's a whole wide, crazy world, and it's really, really neat because not only are we, and I say this broadly in a we, you guys are all much smarter than me, but I'll say this broadly in a we are all in sort of an industry or an area where we actually get to see and play with a lot of technology stuff, and we live in an area where, frankly, it's a bubble, but it's a really fun bubble with lots of cool toys. So we're going to see all this stuff evolving really, really quickly right around us. And responsive web design is the best that, I feel like it's the best that we can do right now to try to get ready for some of this stuff, to be ready for all these devices. I think it works really well. But there is so much more coming, and the best we can do is just to kind of gear up for it and be ready. And that is everything that I actually had to say. If you want to bother us on Twitter, my phone is actually dying. I can't flip to the next screen. Come on, here we go. There we go. Foundation ZURB on Twitter. You can bother us there. If you actually just want to talk to me on Twitter, I'm @Smiley, like the face, @Smiley. So feel free to bother me on there. But thank you very much for your And I thought we would have a few minutes to answer some questions here. Yeah.
So, for A/B testing, anything is optimized?
Oh, for like what do we use for A/B testing, or what do we?
Yeah, how does this thing work?
Oh, works fine. You can use Google Optimizer or what have you. I mean, you have to know that whatever your A/B testing is going to be, you're going to be A/B testing, does my layout or does my design work on X device? If you're testing like functionality or content or things like that, A/B testing works fine. There's nothing in the framework that precludes you from using A/B, for doing A/B testing or doing some level
So
of
it
testing.
will go to the innermost and test something there.
Sure. You can do it wherever you want it. It's all just markup. There's no witchcraft or anything like that. We don't build things on the fly. Yes?
Actually more of an observation, not so much a question. But it's interesting, one of the original goals of HTML was that normally you were trying to present, you were saying what the information was, you weren't necessarily controlling the layout, and now we're back to the point of we're trying to just say, I don't want to do the layout, and it's kind of funny how almost everything was added in, like you get precise control, and now we're trying to get back to no control.
Goes around, comes around.
Yeah.
It is interesting, and like some of the stuff that just frameworks are trying to do now, like semantic markup, is really just trying to get us back to that. And get all of our presentational stuff out of the markup that never should have been there in the first place. It was so much easier to put it there than to do something else. So, cool. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate it.